The Rebellers by Jane Roberts. A novel. Read by Martin John. Chapter 5. There was a brief silence. Sloat Braille cleared his throat. He said, "Well, first of all, we know you're from the gallery, but we don't know your name." "Gary Fitch." "Okay. I'll tell you as much as I can before we have to leave. We're going to start out again when darkness sets in, and tonight the trip will be dangerous. First, we belong to a group called the Rebellers. I don't know if you've heard of us or not. We've often wondered what news, if any, seeps into the galleries. We discovered that the gallery was going to be raided. The people don't realize it yet, but the bubonic plague has broken out again, and it's spreading rapidly. Workers have fallen sick. Food is scarcer than ever. Soon the government will be grabbing everyone they can to replace the dead in the chemical gardens. Anyway, one of our men saw you escape. We have spies to cover any events we might be interested in, and we've wanted to get a hold of some of the artists for a long time. We think that you have some information that is of vital importance to us." He paused, watching Fitch's face, and then continued. "I'll fill in the details later, but we lost you temporarily. You complicated things no end by getting picked up by the street cleaners, and then made things worse by trying to escape from the doctors. Then they kept their eyes on you. Otherwise, we could have gotten you out fairly easily. So we had to resort to using one of our agents, the Undertaker. We don't pull things like that too often either. We can't afford the risks. One of our men had to take your place and be put out of commission for 2 years, in case you're interested. Anyhow, this way the government gave you your shots and fixed your leg, so we didn't have to bother with that. Maybe we came out even after all." "Why did you want someone from the gallery?" Fitch said. "Obviously, I'm like a babe in the woods as far as my knowledge of current affairs is concerned." Sloat grinned. "It's your knowledge of the past that we're concerned with. Manuscripts and all kinds of important information has been withheld from the public for so many generations that we're held back ourselves. We have to know what was tried in order to see where the race failed. We're in a very particular position. At one time, the rebellers had a positive plan of action. We still know what we're rebelling against, but we have no idea of what sort of civilization we want to put in place of what we have now. This is getting involved, though. It can wait." He said soberly, Our journey will present some hazards tonight. I'll tell you ahead of time. The government would like to get its hands on us. We've committed the only real recognizable crime, deprived the country of our capacity for productivity, taken the best specimens of men we could find, built them up, and used them for our own purposes. Incidentally, if you join, it will be voluntarily. If I want to walk out of here now, then I'm free to do so, Fitch said. You can now, Gunny said emphatically. He broke in, talking with that nervous excitability that Finch had noticed earlier. You have met Toby. He'll fill you in. Then if you want to join up, we'll show you the setup. After that, you're ours. You have to make up your mind before you see our facilities. We want to know what you can give us too, you know. That's for Toby to decide, not us, Sloat said quickly. Gunny said quarrelsomely, It's true enough, Fitch. We've taken a lot of chances for you. I hope it's worth it. Remember that kid that kept yelling that his father was mercied? Mercied? The kid that kept saying his father was killed? The one who got the needle instead of you, really? At least he got it out of turn, and that gave us a few minutes to get you. He was a friend of mine. He wasn't too enthusiastic either, being used like that. Sloat broke in somewhat irritably. He needed the rest. He was overworked and sick himself. Sometimes we use the government facilities, Fitch, when it's convenient. It gives our men a period of recuperation and puts them out of circulation when they come under suspicion. They never think of looking for spies in their own undertaking parlors. 2 years later, the man is awakened, sent out to work gardens, and then we get him back again. That's how it will work with the boy. At the same time, we also used him, in this instance, for a double purpose. The attendant isn't ours, only the undertaker. He leaned back, grinning. Quite a bit to take it in at once, isn't it? You should have remained anonymous, Gunny said. We knew you were wounded. We thought we could pick you up easily, but you had the insane determination to see a doctor. That's what we couldn't understand. Why? Doctors used to heal people, Fitch said, not put them out of their misery. I told you I knew more about the past than the present. It doesn't make sense, Gunny said. How could they try to heal the sick? And what would the point of it be? Who would feed all those who couldn't work? You'd end up making slaves of the rest of the population. We can go into all that later, Sloat said. It's time to get out of here. We still have the rest of the city to go through. Fitch, you do what we do. If you don't understand whatever we're doing, do it anyway. We're going to mix with the crowd and transverse the northeast part of the city. And if that isn't bad enough, there's an area of chemical gardens and work fields that we have to pass. He said with a shrug, no one pays much attention to the people in the city proper anyhow. They're the incompetents, the sick, the insane. Sooner or later they get picked up and either straightened out or disposed of in one way or another. But further out are the workers' shacks and gardens, and these are really patrolled. As a rule, no one can get in or out. We have 2 men out there, but the rest is up to us. How come this place is so safe? Fitch said. And Gunny said, you want to know? He grinned meaningfully. Remember, I warned you about rats when we came in? This was plague area not long ago. No one comes near it now. See how these walls glow? We've invented a substance that repels rats and kills infection. Right now, rats aren't used for food, even though they're plentiful. But if we can disinfect the rats first, then we'll add to our supply of available protein. Fitch didn't answer. He looked over at Sloat, but the other man's back was turned. They gathered their things together. Gunny said, so what do you think of that? Rat stew. I've got my reservations, Fitch said soberly. Survival is survival and all, but I'm not sure I left the gallery for the dubious privilege of eating rats. Somehow I'd rather combat the present conditions in the outside rather than make adjustments to them. Sometimes adjustments only lead to further degradation. Sloat said, we have to stay alive to do anything, you know. It's the prime concern. You have to eat. The people I saw in the streets last night were alive, but they weren't much like men, Fitch said slowly. Maybe beyond a certain point, survival is meaningless. You change, or the race changes. Perhaps if you don't survive as reasoning human beings, you don't really survive at all. Oh, Toby will like you, Gunny said with a leer. But Sloat blew the candle out. They crept through the heap of debris. Outside the river was dark, and a cold wind blew down from the mountains. Torches glimmered here and there, and they'd walked only a half a mile when they began to meet crowds of people again. Neon lights blinked outside, tumbled down shops. Nervousness pricked at Fitch's spine. The head was a square, smaller than the one he'd been in the night before, but otherwise identical. Already Fitch heard the loudspeakers. Paintings moved with that curious-like grotesqueness on the sides of the crumbling buildings. Sloat and Gunny attached themselves to the edges of each group of people that they passed, copying their facial expressions and motions. Fitch cautiously followed their example. Suddenly, a low chant caught him up with hypnotic rhythm. To the right of him, about 10 men and women were dancing and chanting at once, weaving back and forth. As Fitch watched, the tempo quickened. People stopped and then, almost unwillingly, joined in. In seconds, the latecomers were twisting and turning with the same frenzied expression, the same uninhibited exultation. For a moment, Fitch forgot everything else, watching. Their abandon was contagious. Their wasted bodies were hung with rags eerily moved in the wind. The momentum picked up again. They danced faster and faster in separate jerky movements, yelling and chanting all the while. A blow hit Fitch on the back of the neck. He shook his head in confusion. A sense of loss flooded through him. Gunny said, "Another smart move like that, and you'll have had it." In some amazement, Fitch looked about. He'd been walking toward the dancers, who were spinning now almost quicker than his eyes could follow. Sloat's long face smiled with some sad toleration. "We took it for granted that you were still with us. Then we looked around and discovered you were gone. You were ready to join the death dancers, in case you're interested. Guess we forgot what it would be like seeing them for the first time." "The what?" "I was watching. At least that's all I thought I was doing," Fitch said. Yet he knew instantly that Sloat was correct. He'd almost been drawn in. "Death dancers," he said. Sloat grabbed his arm. They joined the edges of another group of people who jostled along, quarreling and yelling. "It's some kind of psychopathic disease. They dance themselves to death," Gunny said. "It's just another hazard to look out for. Frightening when you experience it for the first time, though," Sloat said. Fitch couldn't help but throw him a look of gratitude. But the whole thing was like a nightmare. He felt as if he hadn't budged from the square he'd been in the night before. Try as he couldn't escape from the tumultuous sounds and the pressing bodies. It was an effort to think, to pull apart from the noise long enough to compose coherent thoughts. Suddenly he and Sloat and Gunny all fell forward. Fitch tried to get up, but other people were piled on top of him. Finally he got free. The group of men they'd joined had tripped and fallen all together like tenpins. Those behind had fallen on top. Gunny swore. The people began quarreling as to who had tripped first. Automatically, Sloat also adopted an angry, threatening glance. At the same time, he said pleasantly enough, "Turn to the right. We're almost out of here." "Yeah, just don't listen to any more death chants," Gunny said. Just then a hand came out of the crowd and poked Sloat in the head. Sloat knocked down the man that hit him. The vein stuck out in Sloat's forehead. He looked ready to kill. Fitch stood ready to defend himself in case Sloat turned on him, and Sloat's face cleared for a brief second. "Pretty authentic, huh?" he said, but angrily. Gunny said, "Protective coloration. You'll get used to it." At the same time, they found a chance to tag on to a group of revealers, and Gunny's face broke out instantly into an expression of almost idiotic amiability. In like fashion they crossed the areas of greatest tumult until the crowds began to thin out. Gunny said companionably, "Don't let it get you down." And Fitch bristled at the tone of superiority in his voice and didn't answer. Ahead of them it was dark. Fitch still felt a sense of loss. For a moment, as he'd listened to the death dancers, a warm sense of belonging had risen in him, a sense of fulfillment that had vanished the instant that Gunny touched his arm. Now, walking along the hard dirt road, he watched the huddled shacks that rose in the darkness. He listened to Gunny's voice. He saw the land stretched out, outlined against the night sky. He looked out disconsolately at the indistinguishable heaps and old buildings in the distance, and at the odd high structures that loomed ahead. It seemed to him that everything was Gunny's fault. The poverty and the misery and the dreariness of the landscape. Gunny had prevented him from joining the dancers. He hated Gunny's face. Squinting at it sideways in the darkness, he felt that he could sense Gunny's treachery. Man's destiny lay with the dancers. It was clear to him. Into his mind flashed the memory of their exaltation, the abandon of their gestures. He threw Gunny down on the ground and leapt on top of him. Sloat Braille pulled him off Gunny and started slapping his face. "I've got to kill him. Don't you see that?" Finch said. "Shut up," Sloat said, not unkindly. He ripped a piece of dirty cloth off the bottom of his shabby trousers and tied Fitch's mouth. Then he shoved him into a sitting position on the ground. "We've got to get out of here," he said quickly. "Anyone hears a rumpus, and we're liable to have a mob on our hands. Now listen." Gunny stood nearby, watching cautiously. Sloat said, "I told you that the death dance is a psychopathic development, contagious as the devil. You always get a reaction. We were waiting for yours. This hatred of Gunny was it. Do you feel any better? We can't wait around all night." Fitch nodded. The hatred for Gunny died down as quickly as it had arisen. His mind began to function again. Now, however, he was filled with distaste for a civilization in which the individual was so prone and in which he must be so diligent just to perceive his sanity. Sloat removed the gag. Fitch said, "I'm sorry, Gunny." There was a new severity in his voice and a new resolution. Gunny nodded. The shacks gave way to what looked like open country. Then Fitch looked up. The structures that Fitch had glimpsed earlier now rose upward all over, blocking out the sky entirely. In the darkness it was hard to see them clearly, yet he sensed their magnitude and extension. "It's all food," Sloat said, "grown in layers, mostly chemical production, 20 stories high around here for miles. As ground space gets cut down, they have to build higher. The whole continent is littered with these things. You'd think that there would be enough food to feed the world, but it doesn't work that way. You can't depend on the people themselves. They have to be watched every minute, or they won't even work the machines. When they can, they go on food binges and gorge themselves to death, for one thing." "What about water?" Fitch said. "There's never enough. Even the ocean levels are down. The few rivers left never reach their rightful destination because the water is used before it ever gets to the ocean. Now listen, this is what we're going to do. In a quarter of a mile we'll come to the food ramps. The ground will be useless as far as traveling is concerned. We'd be caught in a minute." "But it looks deserted," Fitch said. Gunny said with a short laugh, "Look again." Fitch let his eyes travel over the landscape to the left. Then he realized that what he'd taken for flat, monotonous hills were instead long rectangular structures reaching continuously as far as he could see. "Workers' communes," Gunny said. "They house the food growers, and believe me, they're well guarded." "We wouldn't have a chance," Sloat said. "I told you that we had 2 men out here. One is the night guard at the head of the first ramp. You won't be able to see him, but he can see us. Now the ramps rise up like bridges. We're going to climb the first girder and crawl along just on top of the ramp itself and just below the surface of the level above. There's only a space of about 3 feet between, so we can't go upright. We have to crawl on our hands and knees. If we fall, nothing can save us. There's a drop of 30 feet beneath." End chapter 5. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.